The fog over Montmartre was thicker than usual, a grey veil clinging to the cobblestones, muffling the sound of hurried steps and the faint rattle of a tram disappearing down the hill. Somewhere beneath the shroud of mist, a policeman had vanished, leaving behind only the memory of his night patrol and a few uneasy whispers among the cafes still lit with kerosene lamps. Chief Inspector Maigret, summoned from his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, felt the peculiar chill that comes not from the season, but from the unseen hand of human fate. It was not the first time a man had disappeared in Paris, yet this one carried with it the weight of silent dread, as if the city itself wished to conceal what it had witnessed. Every window shutter, every puddle reflecting the dim street lamps, seemed complicit in the mystery. And so began a case that would carry Maigret through the winding alleys of Montmartre, into the smoky interiors of bistros across the Seine, and deep into the hidden corners of men's lives where truth is rarely confessed, but always felt. Before we descend into that fog with Maigret, into the hearts and shadows of Paris, take a moment to linger with us. Like a friend seated at the corner of a café table, your presence keeps this story alive. If you find yourself drawn to these mysteries, to the atmosphere of the Seine at night, to the scent of pipe smoke curling in a lamplit room, then let your support be known. Subscribe, share, and keep your chair reserved among us, so that each new case may find you waiting. The fog had come rolling down from the heights of Montmartre just after midnight, heavier than the mist that usually clung to the hilltop in spring. It was the kind of fog that dulled the glow of street lamps to pale smudges, that muffled the hooves of the last dray horses and swallowed the laughter spilling from the bars near the Place du Tertre. Against this shroud moved a solitary figure in uniform, his heavy coat buttoned to the throat, lantern swinging in rhythm with his stride. He was a policeman, doing what policemen had done for generations, walking the beat, keeping silent company with the city as it slept uneasily around him. His boots struck the cobbles with steady assurance until, somewhere between the Rue Lepic and the steps descending toward Pigalle, the sound was lost. Not diminished by distance, not drowned out by noise, simply gone, as if the fog had drawn him into its breast and refused to give him back. By dawn, the cafes were opening their shutters, grocers were arranging fruit baskets damp with dew, and the bread carts rolled from the bakeries with loaves still warm from the ovens. Yet there was unease in the air, though no one admitted it aloud. Men sipping their first glasses of wine of the day cast quick glances toward the corners where policemen usually stood. Women in aprons, sweeping thresholds, paused longer than necessary to watch the emptiness of the street. Everyone seemed to know without being told that something had gone wrong in the night. When the first question was asked, "Have you seen him since?" the words carried more weight than the casual tone allowed. By mid-morning the whispers had reached the nearest commissariat, and from there the message travelled by telephone line, clipped and official. A policeman of Montmartre had not returned from his patrol. At the Quai des Orfèvres the news arrived as Maigret was tamping tobacco into the bowl of his pipe. He had been staring out the window at the slow flow of the Seine, its surface broken here and there by barges moving upriver. The message was brief, stripped of detail, but it carried with it a heaviness he recognized at once. Men vanish every day in Paris, clerks who take too much at the office, husbands who run off with women from the music halls, drunkards who wander into alleys and wake in the cells. But a policeman on duty, disappearing between one street and the next, left no room for ordinary explanation. Maigret said nothing as he lit his pipe, only let the smoke curl upward while his mind began to turn. Then with the unhurried gestures of habit, he shrugged on his overcoat and signalled for Lucas to accompany him. The climb up to Montmartre was made in silence, the tram rattling along the tracks, while passengers cast occasional glances at the inspector, whose bulk filled half the bench. The fog had not yet lifted, clinging stubbornly to the slopes and muffling the city below. When they reached the commissariat near the Rue Caulaincourt, the duty officer greeted them with visible relief, as though the weight of the disappearance could now be shifted onto broader shoulders. The missing man's name was Fournier, a veteran of the force with 20 years of service. He had been seen at the start of his round, lantern in hand, cap pulled low against the damp. After that, nothing. No witnesses willing to swear they had heard a struggle. No sign of his body in the alleys, no discarded cap, no torn uniform buttons. The beat was familiar to him, too familiar for him to have lost his way in the fog. He had simply ceased to exist between 1 hour and the next. Maigret walked the route himself, pipe clamped between his teeth, his heavy frame moving at a pace that belied his apparent indolence. The fog hung about him like a second coat, moistening his hat brim, softening the edges of houses into ghostly silhouettes. He stopped before each café still closed, before each stairwell descending into blackness, before each doorway where shadows seemed to linger longer than the eye could explain. He bent once to touch the damp stones, feeling the faint trace of something that might have been a scuff, though it dissolved under his thumb. Lucas trailed behind, notebook in hand, but Maigret dictated nothing. He was not yet seeking facts. He was listening to the silence of the neighborhood, the rhythm of the street, the peculiar tension that seems to remain when violence has brushed past but not declared itself. By noon, the cafes had filled with workers on their break, and the first glasses of white wine were being poured. Maigret chose one at random near the Rue des Abbesses and sat at a table in the back, where the smoke from the stove mingled with the sour smell of damp coats hung by the door. He did not ask questions at once. He ordered a plate of bread and cheese, poured a measure of wine, and allowed his presence to settle like a stone dropped into still water. Only when the owner, curious despite himself, ventured near, did Maigret raise his eyes and murmur the first inquiry. A man in uniform walking past after midnight. Had anyone noticed him stop? Had anyone heard voices in the fog? The answers came reluctantly, hedged with shrugs. Some claimed not to have been awake, others said the fog was too thick. A woman insisted she had seen Fournier speaking to another man, but she could not recall his face, only the angle of his shoulders and the way he leaned close, as if whispering something urgent. She grew flustered as she spoke, twisting her scarf in her hands, and Maigret let her words trail off without pressing her further. There would be time to return to her story. Outside, the bells of Sacré-Cœur tolled the hour, their sound dull in the fog, and Maigret felt the case take on the shape of a puzzle with missing edges. Fournier was not the sort of man to desert his post. His record spoke of reliability, his colleagues vouched for his sobriety, and his family, wife and 2 children, in a modest flat, depended on the steady rhythm of his wages. If he had met with foul play, where was the evidence? If he had been lured, by what promise? The fog itself seemed to have swallowed the answers, holding them in suspension like motes of dust in a shaft of light. As evening approached, the streets of Montmartre grew livelier, lanterns glowing in the taverns, music drifting from cabarets. The fog began to thin at last, revealing the outlines of the city below, lights twinkling along the Seine. Maigret remained seated at a corner table of another café, pipe smoke wreathing his head, watching the play of faces as men and women entered. He was waiting not for confession, but for contradiction, for the slip of memory that would betray knowledge someone wished to hide. Lucas shifted restlessly, but Maigret's patience was immovable, as steady as the Seine's current. A case like this did not yield to haste. It demanded the slow peeling back of silence, the testing of each layer, until the heart of the matter revealed itself. When they left the café at last, the fog had retreated into the alleys, clinging stubbornly where light could not reach. Maigret paused at the steps descending toward Pigalle, where Fournier's boots had last been heard. The stones were slick with damp, the handrail glistening. A cat slunk past, pausing to glance at them with luminous eyes before disappearing into shadow. Somewhere below, a burst of laughter echoed from a dance hall. Maigret drew deeply on his pipe, exhaled, and let the smoke mingle with the mist. A man had vanished here, not by chance, not by whim, but through the deliberate hand of circumstance or malice. The inspector felt the weight of the city pressing in, its secrets dense as the fog, and knew that this was only the beginning. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the building stood like a solemn guardian over the Seine, its stone façade streaked with damp after the night's fog. Inside, the corridors carried the echo of hurried footsteps, the faint scent of ink and damp paper lingering in the air. Maigret's office was a room of dark wood and smoke, the sort of place where time seemed to move more slowly than in the city outside. The big iron stove gave off uneven heat, making one side of the room uncomfortably warm, while the other remained stubbornly cold. On his desk, already heavy with folders tied in twine, fresh reports had begun to gather, each one adding to the unease that had settled over the case. Maigret removed his overcoat, hung it on the hook behind the door, and dropped heavily into his chair. He did not open the reports at once. He lit his pipe instead, filling the room with its familiar smell, and stared at the damp footprints Lucas had tracked in from the street. A policeman had vanished. That fact remained the same, whether it was wrapped in words and official stamps or spoken in whispers over café tables. Still, procedure demanded the accumulation of detail, the assembling of the man's life into neat columns of information. The missing man Fournier had served in the police for 2 decades. Born in a small village in the Auvergne, he had joined the force in his early 20s, served in several quartiers, and eventually settled into his Montmartre post. Married for 15 years, father of 2, no disciplinary record to speak of. He was known to his colleagues as steady, perhaps even dull in his habits. He drank little, avoided gambling, and preferred evenings at home with his family to the smoke and chatter of the bistros. A man like that does not vanish into fog. Maigret drew slowly on his pipe, watching the smoke curl upward toward the ceiling where the plaster bore the faint yellow stain of years of tobacco. Janvier entered with his usual cautious manner, carrying a bundle of telegrams bound with string. He placed them on the desk without a word, waiting until Maigret glanced up. They were from the provinces, routine inquiries sent out whenever a policeman was missing. No, Fournier had not been spotted boarding trains at the larger stations. No, there was no sign of him in the towns beyond Paris. The replies were as expected, but Maigret skimmed them anyway, his heavy finger tracing the lines as if the very rhythm of the telegrapher's words might betray something more than they intended. Lucas leaned against the windowsill, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the grey flow of the Seine outside. "It makes no sense, Chief. A man like Fournier doesn't just disappear." Maigret said nothing, only tapped the bowl of his pipe gently against the ashtray. Sense had little to do with it. The city did not operate according to sense. It moved by undercurrents, by whims of chance and weakness, by secrets carried like stones in the pockets of ordinary men. Somewhere in Fournier's steady life there must have been a crack, invisible to colleagues and family alike, through which the fog had seeped. The Commissariat of Montmartre had sent over their own notes. Maigret opened the folder slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the silence of the paper. Statements from Fournier's fellow officers confirmed the routine. He had begun his patrol at midnight, cap pulled low, lantern in hand. He was expected to return by 4, but when the patrol ended, his absence was noted. At first they thought he had lingered at one of the cafes to escape the chill, but as the hours stretched, unease grew. By dawn the search had begun, though without result. Maigret paused at a short, hastily written note near the bottom of the file. It came from a woman who claimed to have seen Fournier speaking with someone in the fog near the canal. Her description was vague, little more than a shape leaning toward him, but she insisted it was not a fellow officer. Her words were scrawled, uncertain, yet Maigret felt a twinge of recognition. She might be the same woman who had spoken nervously in the café earlier. Already her story was making its way into the official record, though it trembled with the same uncertainty as her voice had done. Janvier cleared his throat. "Should we extend the search beyond Montmartre?" "Not yet," Maigret murmured. "The city is too wide. A man can vanish anywhere if one chooses to believe it. Better to begin where the fog was thickest." He rose from his chair, pacing the narrow length of the office, pipe smoke trailing after him. The room seemed smaller when he moved, the shadows cast by the stove flickering against the walls. He was not thinking of the wider city just yet. He was picturing Fournier as he must have looked that night, boots damp with fog, lantern swaying, eyes scanning the familiar corners. A man who knew every stairwell, every archway. For him to be surprised, something unusual must have interrupted the routine. A figure waiting, a voice calling his name, a sound that drew him into shadow. The reports offered no hint of such a presence. No one had admitted to being abroad at the hour when Fournier vanished. Yet Maigret knew that Paris never truly slept. There were always men drifting from taverns, women walking home in silence, cab drivers pausing for a smoke, clerks lingering too late over their accounts. They had seen something, surely, or perhaps they had chosen not to see. In Montmartre, silence could be as deliberate as speech. Lucas broke the stillness. His family. "Shall we send someone?" Maigret shook his head. "Not yet. Not until we have more than fog to offer them." He disliked the cruelty of arriving at a wife's doorstep with nothing but absence. He preferred to wait until there was something solid to grasp, a fragment of cloth, a testimony worth more than a rumour. Until then, Fournier's family would keep their fragile hope. Outside, the day pressed on, the city alive with the noise of carts and trams, the calls of vendors drifting across the river. In Maigret's office, the weight of the report seemed to anchor the air itself. He sat again, pipe between his teeth, and began reading through Fournier's personnel file, line by line. Dates, addresses, commendations for steady service. The picture was one of ordinariness, yet it was precisely this ordinariness that disturbed him most. He had learned long ago that when a man like Fournier vanished, the explanation was never simple. Janvier excused himself to follow up with the telegraph office, and Lucas went to consult the station records once more. Alone, Maigret leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and closed his eyes. He saw Fournier's lantern swaying in the fog, heard the dull strike of his boots, and then nothing. Silence. A silence thicker than mist, a silence that carried intent. Somewhere in the city that silence still clung, waiting to be disturbed. By late afternoon, the light outside the window had turned the Seine a dull pewter. The first of the evening's street lamps flickered uncertainly to life, their glow reflected in the current. Maigret rose once more, pulled on his overcoat, and placed his hat firmly on his head. He would return to Montmartre before nightfall. Reports and telegrams built a picture, but it was never the whole. To understand a disappearance, One had to breathe the same air as the streets where it had happened, to feel the damp stones beneath the hand, to watch the shadows stretch as darkness fell. He locked the office behind him, the echo of the key turning in the door, fading into the corridor's emptiness. The Quai des Orfèvres seemed to hold its breath as he descended the worn stairs, pipe smoke still clinging to his coat. The Seine flowed on, indifferent, bearing with it the secrets of a city that never ceased to conceal as much as it revealed. Maigret paused on the embankment, gazing across the water, toward the northern hills where Montmartre waited, still shrouded in its uneasy mist. Fournier had walked into that fog and not returned. Now it was Maigret's turn to enter it, step by step, until the silence broke. The café at the corner of Rue des Abbesses was neither grand nor particularly clean, but it carried that indefinable intimacy born of long nights, spilled wine, and the kind of patrons who never quite left, even when the shutters were drawn. Its windows were fogged with condensation, the glass blurred by the heat of the stove inside. When Maigret pushed the door open, a bell tinkled overhead, and all eyes turned briefly toward the heavy figure filling the doorway before returning, with studied indifference, to their drinks. The inspector hung his hat on the rack, brushed the damp from his overcoat, and moved to a table in the corner. The smell of stale tobacco and coffee grounds lingered in the air, mingled with the faint perfume of damp wool drying slowly near the stove. It was late afternoon, and the light outside had already begun to fade into the soft grey of evening. The café's lamps glowed with a yellow haze, their mantles sputtering faintly. Behind the counter, the patron polished a glass with deliberate slowness, his eyes flicking toward Maigret now and again. It did not take long for the inspector's presence to spread unease through the room. A group of workmen lowered their voices, a pair of women leaned closer together, whispering behind their hands. Maigret ordered a glass of white wine and allowed himself to sit in silence, pipe unlit, hands resting heavily on the table. He knew well enough that silence could be more effective than questions. It was the woman in the red scarf who finally approached him. She was neither young nor old, her face lined not by age so much as by worry, the sort of worry that becomes permanent after years of narrow means and sharper disappointments. The scarf was knotted tightly around her neck, as though to conceal more than it revealed. She carried herself with hesitation, yet there was also a flicker of determination in her eyes. When she reached the table, she did not sit at once, but stood looking at him, waiting for the invitation. Maigret gestured to the chair opposite, and she lowered herself onto it, hands twisting the edge of the scarf. "You're the inspector, aren't you?" she asked, voice pitched low, so that it did not carry. Maigret inclined his head without speaking. The woman drew a breath, glanced toward the counter, where the patron pretended to polish another glass, and then leaned forward. "I saw him," she said. "The policeman, the one they're saying vanished." Her words came in a rush, as if rehearsed in her mind a dozen times before being given voice. She explained that she had been on her way home after visiting a friend near the canal, the fog so thick that she kept one hand on the wall as she walked. It was then she saw Fournier, or rather the glow of his lantern first, swaying faintly in the mist. He was not alone. Another man stood close, speaking to him in a voice too low for her to catch. She could not see the stranger's face, only the angle of his body, the way he leaned slightly forward, as though pressing some secret into Fournier's ear. "What did the policeman do?" Maigret asked, his voice calm, almost casual. "He listened," the woman replied. "That's what struck me. He wasn't giving orders, he wasn't pushing the man away. He stood still, listening, like he was, considering." She hesitated, eyes darting to the door as though fearing someone might enter. Then I turned the corner and the fog swallowed them. I didn't hear anything after that. No struggle, no cry, nothing. Maigret studied her face as she spoke. There was sincerity in her eyes, yet also a hesitation, as if part of her story had been left unsaid. He asked for a description of the man, but she shook her head. Too dark, too much mist, only a shadow, a posture. She repeated the detail of the lean, the whisper, almost obsessively, as though clinging to the one fragment she was certain of. "Why did you wait until now to speak?" Maigret asked gently. Her hands gripped the scarf tighter. "Because who would believe me? They'd say I'd been drinking, or that I made it up for attention. People always talk, especially in a place like this. But when I heard he never came home, I couldn't keep it to myself." Her voice trembled, and for a moment Maigret saw in her the weary figure of someone accustomed to being doubted. He let her words linger between them, unchallenged, allowing her to feel the weight of having spoken aloud. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows once more, though thinner now, streaked with the first drizzle of rain. The sound of drops tapping against the glass filled the silence. "Did you recognize the voice?" he asked finally. She shook her head. "No, but it wasn't a stranger's voice. It had the sound of someone who belonged there, someone who knew the streets as well as he did." That, more than anything else, caught Maigret's attention. A stranger might vanish in Montmartre, but a man of the neighborhood carried its sounds in his throat, its cadence in his words. If Fournier had been listening, it was perhaps because he recognized something familiar in that whisper. The patron of the café shuffled closer, feigning the need to adjust bottles behind the counter. His eyes betrayed curiosity, even unease. Maigret registered it without turning his head. Silence again. The woman had offered enough for now. He did not press her for more, though he suspected she carried further knowledge, something she feared to speak aloud. Instead, he finished his glass of wine, set the coin upon the table, and rose with the slow, deliberate movement of a man whose weight was more than physical. At the door he paused, drawing on his pipe, though it was not yet lit, and cast one final glance around the café. The faces avoided his gaze, some with genuine ignorance, others with the studied neutrality of those who preferred not to be drawn into matters larger than themselves. The woman in the red scarf sat motionless at the table, her eyes lowered, her fingers twisting the cloth as though it were a talisman. Outside, the rain had thickened, pattering on the cobbles, washing the last traces of fog into the gutters. Maigret pulled up the collar of his coat and stood for a moment beneath the awning, pipe clenched between his teeth. A shadow leaning forward, a whisper in the fog, a policeman listening. These fragments turned in his mind like loose stones, their edges not yet fitting together. He knew better than to force them. They would settle in their own time, revealing their connections only when ready. He walked slowly down the slope of Rue Lepic, rain soaking the brim of his hat. The city smelled of wet stone, of smoke curling from chimneys, of roasted chestnuts sold from a cart at the corner. Somewhere a piano played faintly, its notes drifting from a cabaret. Paris was alive, indifferent, carrying on as though one of its guardians had not dissolved into the mist. Yet Maigret felt the absence like a weight in his chest. The woman in the café had given him more than she realized, not facts, not proof, but the shape of a moment. Fournier had not been surprised by the stranger. He had not raised his lantern in suspicion. He had stood still, listening, which meant trust or at least recognition. And trust in the wrong alley at the wrong hour could be fatal. Maigret reached the corner where the steps descended toward Pigalle and paused. The rain glistened on the stones, making them treacherous. A single tram rattled past, its bell clanging mournfully. He drew deeply on his pipe, finally striking a match and letting the smoke warm his lungs. Somewhere in Montmartre, in a room not yet uncovered, the answer waited. He had the faintest impression, almost an intuition, that the city itself resisted his search, wrapping its secrets tighter around it. But the fog would lift again, it always did, and when it did, silence would give way to revelation. For now, he turned back toward the commissariat, coat heavy with rain, his thoughts fixed on the woman with the red scarf and the whisper in the fog. The fog had retreated, but the canal still carried its own kind of darkness. It was dusk when Maigret and Lucas arrived at the edge of the water, the air heavy with the odor of damp stone, stagnant weeds, and coal smoke drifting from the barges moored along the towpath. The canal stretched in a line of grey water broken by ripples from the occasional barge moving under low bridges, their lanterns reflected like wavering coins. To most Parisians, the place was a shortcut, a shadowed border between streets, but to Maigret it was a reservoir of secrets. Men lingered here, who avoided the boulevards, their voices muffled against the water's slow current. A watchman from one of the barges had sent word that on the night of Fournier's disappearance he thought he heard a splash, a heavy sound as though something large had been dropped from the bank. He had not raised alarm then, accustomed as he was to the noises of the city. Only later, when rumours of the missing policeman reached him, did the memory return with a weight he could not ignore. He greeted Maigret and Lucas with cautious politeness, cap pulled low, his face red from the cold. He pointed with a calloused hand toward the spot near a set of stone steps leading down to the water. "I was having a smoke," the watchman said. "Couldn't see much through the fog, just heard it, like a sack of coal going under. No voices, no struggle, just that." Maigret crouched near the steps, his overcoat straining against his knees. The stones were slick with moss, glistening faintly in the lamplight. He touched the surface with a thick finger, felt the slime, the coldness that seeped into bone. He looked out over the water where shadows slid beneath the surface, stirred by unseen movement. If something had been dropped here, the canal would hold it like a vault, its current too sluggish to carry it far. Yet the canal was also patient. It gave up its secrets only when it pleased. Lucas stood above, pipe unlit in his hand, his eyes following the line of the bank. If it was Fournier, he left the thought unfinished. Maigret grunted, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. The water gave nothing away. The splash could have been a bundle of rags, a stolen crate, or nothing at all. And yet in his mind he heard the echo of the woman's words, Fournier standing, listening, then silence. The canal seemed the natural continuation of that silence, its surface unbroken, as though absorbing the city's hidden acts. They walked along the towpath, the sound of their boots carrying strangely in the damp air. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell silent. The lamps along the canal gave off halos of yellow light, distorted by the mist rising once more from the water. A man shuffled past them, shoulders hunched, muttering to himself, his eyes avoiding theirs. Maigret watched him go, the figure disappearing beneath the arch of a bridge. At one narrow stretch, Lucas pointed to the ground. "Here, footsteps." In the damp earth by the bank, half-erased impressions lingered. Not clear enough to distinguish, but enough to suggest recent movement. One print larger, heavier, the other lighter, as though someone had followed closely. Maigret knelt, pipe clenched between his teeth, examining them without speaking. He did not need certainty. The possibility was enough. A man in uniform, accompanied, led perhaps toward the water. The barges loomed like hulks in the darkness, their names painted in peeling letters, their decks cluttered with ropes, crates, and oil drums. On one, a child's laughter rang out briefly, followed by a woman's sharp rebuke. Life continued above the water, even as death might have claimed it below. Maigret felt the weight of that duality, the city's insistence on carrying on, indifferent to the struggles swallowed by its shadows. At the far end of the towpath, they entered a narrower passage between warehouses, their walls weeping damp. The smell here was stronger, the odour of rot and kerosene mingling in the air. Maigret paused, listening. There it was again, the faintest echo of footsteps, not their own. Someone else moving, retreating at the sound of their presence. Lucas quickened, but Maigret raised a hand, slowing him. To chase shadows in such places was to run endlessly without gaining ground. Better to let the silence betray them in its own time. They stopped at another set of steps descending to the canal. Here the watchman had said he sometimes saw men meeting after midnight, their silhouettes visible only as shifting smudges in the fog. The steps themselves were slick, the lowest half submerged, water lapping softly against them. Maigret stared at the surface, his reflection fractured by ripples. Somewhere beneath, perhaps, Fournier's lantern had sunk, its light extinguished forever. Lucas lit his pipe at last, the flare of the match briefly illuminating his lined face. "Do you believe he was thrown in, Chief?" Maigret did not answer at once. He watched the smoke rise from Lucas's pipe, mingling with the mist. Then he spoke slowly. "If a man disappears in Montmartre, it is not the canal that decides his fate. It is another man. The water is only a witness." They returned to the commissariat with little more than the damp on their coats and the echo of footsteps in their ears. Yet Maigret carried away more than evidence. He carried the certainty that Fournier's disappearance was no accident, no misstep into fog. The silence of the towpath, the hurried shadow slipping away, the splash recalled by the watchman, all pointed toward deliberate intent. And behind that intent, he felt the presence of a man who knew these streets well enough to use the fog as cover, the canal as refuge. Back at his office later, Maigret stood at the window overlooking the Seine. The river there was broader, faster, but no less secretive. The city's lights shimmered on its surface, while beyond them Montmartre loomed in darkness, its hill rising like a shadow against the night sky. He filled his pipe once more, struck a match, and inhaled deeply. Fournier had walked into the fog and had been led, willingly or unwillingly, toward silence. Maigret did not yet know who had whispered to him, who had leaned close enough to be trusted in that moment. But he knew that trust was the first step toward betrayal. As the match burned low in his fingers, he let it fall into the ash-tray, where it smouldered briefly before dying out. Outside, the city moved restlessly, indifferent to the policeman who had vanished in its night air. But Maigret felt its pulse, steady and ominous, like the slow current of the canal. The footsteps were still there, waiting for him to follow. The lodging-house stood on a narrow street that twisted away from the Rue Lepic like a forgotten vein, its cobbles uneven, its gutters filled with rainwater that reflected the dim glow of a single lamp. The facade of the building was grey with soot, its shutters warped by years of damp. It was the kind of place Maigret had seen 100 times across Paris, a place where tenants came and went with the seasons, where poverty pressed. Against the thin walls, and the smell of kerosene lingered like a permanent tenant of its own. He stood for a moment outside the door, pipe clamped between his teeth, listening to the muffled sounds within. A chair scraped across a floor. Someone coughed. A woman's voice murmured something indistinct. The heavy figure of Maigret filled the doorway as he pushed it open, the hinges complaining with a long creak. The interior was dim, the air heavy with damp bread, cabbage soup, and the faint reek of unwashed laundry. Behind a counter that served as both reception and barrier stood the landlord, a man whose age was indeterminate. He might have been 50, he might have been 70. His hair was thin, plastered flat against his skull, his skin the colour of old parchment. He did not startle when Maigret entered. Instead, he looked up with the calmness of one who had already decided how much or how little he would say. "You're the inspector," the landlord muttered, not as a question, but as acknowledgement. Maigret removed his hat, shook the rain from it, and set it on the counter. "I hear your tenants keep early hours." His tone was neutral, almost conversational, yet his eyes never left the man's. The landlord shrugged, a gesture of indifference that seemed to weigh heavily on his narrow shoulders. "People come and go, some work nights, some sleep all day. What does it matter to me?" It was precisely the kind of answer Maigret expected. He leaned slightly on the counter, pipe smoke curling from his lips, filling the space between them. "On the night Fournier disappeared, did you notice anyone returning later than usual?" The landlord's face remained unreadable. Fog was thick. Could have been anyone, or no one at all. Silence stretched between them. Behind the counter, a clock ticked faintly, each second sounding louder than the last. Maigret did not press at once. He let the weight of his presence sink in, let the silence do its work. The landlord shifted on his feet, his eyes flicking briefly toward the staircase that rose behind him, narrow and steep, its steps worn by countless feet. Maigret followed his gaze. "Who lives on the second floor?" "Couple of labourers, a widow with her boy, quiet folk." "And the third?" "Students, painters, the kind that don't pay on time." His mouth twitched as though in irritation, though the gesture seemed rehearsed. "And the top floor?" The landlord hesitated, his lips pressing together. "Rooms are empty there," he said finally. Maigret drew slowly on his pipe. "Empty?" "Yes." He said it firmly, but too firmly, the kind of firmness that tries to replace truth with certainty. Maigret glanced at Lucas, who had entered quietly, and now stood near the wall, hands in his coat pockets. Lucas caught the inspector's eye and gave the faintest nod. Without another word, Maigret walked to the staircase and began to climb. The boards creaked beneath his weight, the air growing colder with each step. On the second floor, a door opened a crack, and a child's face peered out, wide-eyed. The boy's mother quickly drew him back, murmuring apologies, but Maigret only raised his hat in acknowledgement and continued upward. The third floor smelled of turpentine and stale smoke. Canvases leaned against walls, and laughter drifted faintly from behind a closed door, though it stopped abruptly as the footsteps passed. Finally, at the top floor, the inspector reached a corridor that seemed abandoned. The wallpaper peeled in strips, damp stains spread across the ceiling, and the air was cold as if the rooms themselves had been uninhabited for years. Yet Maigret noticed a faint trace, an odour that did not belong to emptiness. Kerosene, yes, but also sweat, tobacco, the unmistakable presence of life. He tried the first door, locked, the second, locked as well. He paused, pipe clenched between his teeth, listening. In the silence, a sound whispered from behind the third door, a floorboard shifting, weight moving cautiously. Someone was there. Maigret returned downstairs without a word. The landlord looked up as he descended, his expression carefully blank. The inspector walked to the counter, replaced his hat on his head, and leaned close enough for the man to feel the heat of his pipe. "Empty," you said?" The landlord's throat bobbed. "So they should be, but sometimes—" His voice faltered. "Sometimes people find their way in, without permission, temporary." Maigret said nothing. He left the silence to deepen until the landlord filled it himself. "They don't pay rent. They don't stay long. I mind my own affairs. It's safer that way." "Safer for whom?" Maigret asked quietly. The landlord did not answer. His eyes shifted again toward the stairs, then back to the inspector. Sweat glistened faintly on his forehead despite the chill of the room. Maigret knew the type well, a man who survived not by honesty, but by silence, who measured his words against the risk of reprisal from those who moved in the shadows of the city. To speak too much was to invite danger. Better to feign ignorance, to say nothing, to let the walls carry the secrets. Still, the silence itself was a confession. Someone had been there that night, someone the landlord preferred not to name, and Fournier, obedient, steady Fournier, might have followed a whisper into that very stairwell, never to emerge. The inspector straightened, took up his hat, and moved toward the door. He did not force the matter then. Forcing words from men like the landlord only drove them deeper into fear. It was better to let silence sit, heavy and oppressive, until the man's conscience, or his cowardice, demanded release. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the cobbles glistening like black glass. Maigret lit his pipe, drawing deeply, the smoke warming him against the damp. Lucas joined him, his collar turned up. "He knows more than he'll say," Lucas muttered. "They always do," Maigret replied. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke mingle with the mist rising from the gutters. "It's not the silence that matters. It's what it hides. And silence like that is never empty. It's crowded." They walked away from the lodging house, their footsteps echoing in the narrow street. Behind them the landlord stood at the window, watching, his pale face half hidden by the curtain. The building loomed, heavy with its unspoken knowledge, every shutter and stairwell complicit in the mystery. Maigret felt the weight of it settle into his bones. Somewhere behind those locked doors, Fournier's lantern had gone dark. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving Montmartre washed, but not renewed, the stones slick with moisture, the gutters running with thin streams that caught scraps of paper and carried them down the hill. The air was sharp, carrying the mingled scents of roasting coffee from corner cafes and the acrid smoke of coal stoves struggling to light. It was in such air that the first fragile thread appeared, not from an officer's report or a landlord's reluctant word, but from a child's careless game in the alleys. The boy could not have been more than 10, his knees bare, his cap too large for his head. He darted among the puddles with other children, their laughter shrill, echoing between the walls. When Maigret and Lucas turned into the narrow street, pipe smoke drifting from the inspector's lips, the children froze, their laughter swallowed at once by curiosity and unease. One of them, emboldened, held something aloft in his grubby hand, as though offering tribute to the heavy figure of the law who had entered their playground. It was a scrap of cloth, dark blue, frayed at the edges. Maigret's eyes narrowed. He reached out, and the boy, after a brief hesitation, placed it in his palm. The fabric was coarse, unmistakable in its weave, the kind issued by the police tailors for their uniforms. Maigret rubbed it between thumb and forefinger, feeling its stiffness, its history. It was not torn from wear. It had been ripped, sudden and violent, from a sleeve or a tunic. "Where did you find this?" Maigret asked, his tone even, not stern but carrying weight. The boy shifted, glancing at his companions. Then he pointed toward the steps of a nearby church, its doors still closed at that hour. "There," he said, on the stones, near the rail." Maigret followed the direction with his gaze. The steps rose steeply, slick with rain, their rail glistening. Above, the church loomed, its facade dark against the pale sky. He pocketed the scrap, then placed a heavy hand briefly on the boy's shoulder, a gesture both of thanks and dismissal. The children scattered, their shouts resuming once they were certain no reprimand would follow. Together, Maigret and Lucas climbed the steps. At the top, the doors were locked, the iron cold under Maigret's touch. He stood there, breathing heavily from the climb, pipe clamped in his teeth, eyes scanning the square. The rain had left everything clean, yet not cleansed. The scrap of cloth might have been overlooked for days had it not clung to a child's curiosity. Lucas crouched near the rail, studying the stones. "No more cloth here," he said. "But look, scuffs, as though someone stumbled. See the mark where the heel slipped?" Maigret bent, following his colleague's pointing finger. Yes, a faint impression remained, blurred by rain but still visible. A man had slipped, caught himself, perhaps during a struggle. The inspector pictured it, Fournier's heavy boots, steady on the stones, then a sudden pull, a jerk, fabric tearing, the lantern swaying wildly before the fog swallowed its light. The church square was quiet, only a single old woman crossing it with a basket of bread balanced on her arm. She glanced toward the two policemen, her eyes flicking to the rail, then quickly away. Maigret noted the gesture. Fear, or perhaps habit. In neighborhoods such as this, people saw more than they admitted, but they guarded their words as though each one were a coin that might be stolen from them. He remained a long while at the steps, saying nothing, his pipe smoke curling upward into the damp air. A torn scrap of uniform was not proof of murder, nor even of violence, but it was proof of contact, of proximity. Fournier had been here. That much was certain now, and if his uniform had been torn, it was not by chance. Back at the commissariat, the scrap was examined under the grey light that fell through the windows. The duty officer confirmed at once it matched the cloth used for police tunics. The stitching at the edge showed it had been ripped, not cut. The weight of silence in the room deepened as the fact settled. One of their own had not simply vanished. He had been pulled, resisted, left behind a trace. Janvier arrived with news that added little but colour. Rumours spreading in the cafes, speculation running like spilled wine. Some claimed Fournier had been seen boarding a train in disguise, others that he had been caught in some scandal and spirited away by colleagues to avoid disgrace. The newspapers, too, had begun to circle, their reporters sniffing at doorways, scribbling notes in margins of cafes. But Maigret knew the truth lay not in rumour, but in the weight of cloth pressed into his palm by a boy's dirty hand. He kept the scrap on his desk, laid flat as though it might speak, if given time. He stared at it for long minutes, pipe smoke rising steadily, the city's noises faint through the thick walls of the Quai des Orfèvres. A man's life had narrowed to this torn fragment, mute but eloquent. He wondered whether Fournier had realized in that instant when the cloth tore that he was crossing from routine into danger. Or had he trusted until the very end, listening, leaning toward a whisper, even as the fabric gave way? In the evening, Maigret returned to the church steps alone. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with the smell of wet stone. He climbed slowly, his boots leaving prints on the damp surface, and stood once more before the locked doors. The city around him moved with indifference, trams rattling, vendors calling, lovers whispering under umbrellas. Yet here, on these steps, silence reigned. He placed his hand on the cold iron rail, as if it might hold memory, and for a moment he felt the echo of struggle, the faint resistance of a man torn from his path. When he descended again, the streets of Montmartre were alive with evening light, the cafes glowing, music drifting from doorways. But Maigret carried with him the heaviness of cloth, the knowledge that Fournier's path had ended not in choice, but in force. The city was beginning to whisper, its rumours spreading, yet the truth was simpler, harsher, and it weighed in his pocket like a stone. He returned to the quay where the scrap remained upon his desk, silent witness to violence. The lamp burned low, casting long shadows, and the inspector sat heavily in his chair, pipe clenched in his teeth. He knew the silence would not last. The cloth would speak, not in words, but in the confessions it would force from others, from the landlord's hesitations, from the woman's trembling voice in the café, from the footsteps by the canal. All of it was connected. The city's silence was not endless. It was a dam, and sooner or later it would break. For now, though, the office was quiet save for the creak of the chair and the steady rhythm of Maigret's breathing. He stared at the scrap, as if willing it to yield the name of the man who had torn it, the shadow who had leaned close in the fog. Outside, Paris lived on, unaware of the fragment of uniform that lay like an accusation on the inspector's desk. By morning, Paris had already begun to speak with the mouths of strangers. The kiosks along the boulevards bloomed with damp newspapers clipped by wooden pins, their headlines fat with certainty and thin with truth. A boy in a cap called out the day's scandal in a voice cracked by early hours, the papers slapping each other in the wind like fish on a market stall. Maigret, collar up against the lingering chill, paused at the corner by the Pont Saint-Michel and watched the city read itself. Hands in gloves and hands raw from work, hands smelling of ink and hands smelling of onions. Everyone reached for the same rumour, dressed as fact. A policeman gone, a canal, a whisper. The paragraphs marched across the pages with the brisk confidence of men who had not climbed the Montmartre steps in the rain, who had not felt a scrap of cloth in the palm as heavy as a stone. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors were noisier than usual, the air damp and filled with that particular excitement that comes when the press finds a scent. Janvier arrived with a small stack of clippings under his arm, as if bearing offerings to a shrine he did not trust. He laid them on Maigret's desk without comment, his eyes already apologizing for the nonsense he knew was inside. The inspector took his time. He tamped his pipe, struck a match, and let the paper smoke mingle with the tobacco until the room smelled like a printing shop and a winter stove together. One article placed Fournier in disguise on a night train to the coast, where a woman with a tragic past had lured him from duty. Another discovered corruption buried like a rot within the ranks, with Fournier as either saint or scapegoat, depending on the column's mood. A third, written by a man who had once shaken Maigret's hand in polite contempt, proposed a theory so complicated that it required the city to behave like a machine built for intrigue and not like the muddled animal it had always been. Each piece wore the costume of certainty, names of streets spelled correctly, discreet references to police sources, a confident finger pointed at a silhouette that shifted when you tried to hold it. Lucas drifted in, reading over Maigret's shoulder. "If we follow them all, Chief, we'll end the day with 12 culprits, 3 martyrs and a confession from the Seine." "The Seine confesses nothing," Maigret said, not looking up. "It carries and forgets." He laid one clipping aside, then another, until the desktop looked as if it had sprouted feathers. Only one article drew a longer stare, a small column wedged between advertisements for patent tonics and a travelling spectacle. It mentioned, not boldly but with a careful shrug, that Fournier had once reported a brawl outside a lodging house on a narrow street off the Rue Lepic. No names, no follow-up. A scrap of memory set in type. It was nothing perhaps, or perhaps the echo of the landlord's silence finding its way into print by the roundabout path of a neighbour's gossip. Paris had 1,000 mouths. One had slipped. By mid-morning, the first reporter presented himself in person, hat in hand, moustache combed to a point that seemed designed for poking at other men's patience. He asked politely for a statement, then less politely, then with that false camaraderie which supposes that men who both smoke are therefore allies. Maigret listened until the questions became assertions, and when the man paused for breath, the inspector exhaled a slow plume and said only, "If you print certainty, you'll owe the truth an apology later. It rarely returns to collect." The moustache bristled, the hat dipped, and the man retreated, leaving a scent of wet wool and thwarted ink. But the presses did not halt because the quay offered no banquet. They fed themselves on café tables. In Montmartre, the words grew louder with each glass poured. Fournier's lantern acquired new colours, his boots a new gait, his wife a lover, his service a secret. A pianist in a back room told a girl he had seen 2 silhouettes wrestling at the canal. By the time she told her friend, there were 3 silhouettes and a pistol. In a barge cabin, the watchman's memory gained a chain and a padlock. In a garret studio, a painter swore he had glimpsed a cap placed on a windowsill, as if in ritual, though his own cap sat beside the easel. The city was making a story because it feared the vacuum where silence lived. Every gap summoned an invention to fill it. Maigret preferred the gaps. They told him where the city could not look. He spent the noon hour not in Montmartre, but in a quiet café near the Halle, the kind with a zinc counter, worn smooth by elbows, and a single clock that ran a minute slow. He took his place where he could see the door and the street beyond, the steam from the pot-au-feu fogging the glass. When Janvier joined him, the younger man slid into the seat with the expression of one who has rehearsed a report and already dislikes the sound of it. The press had reached Fournier's family. A neighbour had shared a theory at the stairwell, and the theory arrived in the shape of pity so heavy that the wife could not carry it without trembling. She asked if we had found his lantern. Janvier said softly. "We found the cloth," Maigret replied. "Lanterns tell light, cloth tells hands." They ate slowly, neither tasting much. Outside, carts rattled over damp stones, and a delivery boy laughed with a girl who stood barefoot on the threshold of a greengrocer, bare feet in April, as if to prove the season's courage. Maigret felt the tug of the city's ordinary life, that stubbornness that kept the soup simmering while a man's fate went unspoken in a dozen rooms. He had long since learned to respect it. The ordinary did not mock tragedy. It refused to be taught by it. When he returned to Montmartre in the afternoon, the fog had burned away, but its moral cousin remained in the talk. He chose his cafés carefully, favouring corners where the conversation slowed without stopping. He found the woman in the red scarf again, not by seeking her, but because people who have spoken once often hover near the place where their courage was spent, as if some of it might still be recovered from the air. She did not approach him this time. She let him approach her, which made the difference between interrogation and confession. Without preface, she told him that a man had asked her the night before whether the police were offering money for information. She gave his description in the units of poverty, the frayed cuff, the scarf mended at the knot, the fingernails etched with oil. She had not seen his face clearly, but she remembered his smell, tobacco that was not French, harsher, a cheap blend carried by men who slept too close to draughty windows. "Did he say what he knew?" Maigret asked. "He asked what it was worth," she said, and the corner of her mouth twitched. "I told him the worth of a man's fate can't be measured and should be." He left her with a nod that was both thanks and apology. Outside, He drew on his pipe and held the smoke until it nearly ached. A man bartering knowledge had entered the circuit, which meant the city felt a coin pass from hand to hand, even where there was no coin. When money enters a story, the story learns to walk faster. At the commissariat, a parcel awaited him, brown paper twined and stamped with the impatience of a small newspaper office that expected gratitude. Inside lay a proof of the evening's edition, the type not yet locked, with a space left for a single detail that could elevate rumour into print. A note joined it, scrawled with the urgency of men who confuse speed with accuracy. Confirmation requested regarding a scrap of police cloth found near a church. Maigret stared at the hole in the column where his confirmation might go, a rectangular hunger. He let the proof rest on the desk, the paper sucking the damp from the air, then folded it once and slid it into a drawer. When the press found no confirmation, it would eat something else. It always did. Twilight came, and with it the first editions. Boys ran with bundles tucked under their arms, casting echoes along the streets. In the café near the steps to Pigalle, men read aloud to those who preferred listening, their voices giving drama to lines that had been composed to need it. The landlord's house received a paper too. Maigret watched from the angle of a doorway as the man accepted it without thanks and without coin, arranged his face into the blankness that is the counterfeit of calm, and carried it inside as if hiding a flame. In a corner of Montmartre, where the hill loosened into alleys, the inspector stood under a street lamp whose mantle chimed with the faintest tremor, a song of gas and glass. He imagined the presses far across the river, iron throats swallowing ink and spitting knowledge. He imagined the sheets flying out hot to the touch, and the men feeding them with arms that would ache before midnight. He imagined Fournier's name passing from mouth to mouth like a coin rubbed smooth with use, losing its features until it became only a sound. From time to time, politics bent its whisper into the gossip, a deputy's aide at a table near the window, talking softly about public trust, a remark about order, a flash of the word scandal like a match struck for a lamp. It slid through the talk not as substance, but as pressure, the way a barometer needle moves before the rain. The police, the Republic, the face Paris prefers to show itself in the mirror. They were not yet the story, but they were already inside it, making room. Night settled. The cafes brightened as if in defiance. A pianist tested the keys, coughing up a melody that sounded like wet coal catching fire. Maigret stepped away from the light and let the dark adjust him to its measure. He had the press pressed between thumb and forefinger now, feeling its heat without letting it burn his judgment. The gossip told him what the city wanted and what it feared. It wanted audiobook, villain, so that the water would not seem complicit. It feared that one policeman might be lost to chance, because chance is an insult to order. Neither want nor fear would find him the man who had leaned toward Fournier in the fog. When he finally turned his steps toward the canal, the towpath was a ribbon of dull silver, and the barges slept under their tarps. He paused where the watchman had pointed days ago, and listened, not for footsteps, but for the absence of them. Somewhere behind him a paper boy laughed, the high, brittle sound of profit counted by the dozen. Somewhere ahead a rat disturbed the reeds. He thought of the proof locked in his desk drawer, of the empty rectangle waiting for a word that would set type forever, and he pitied the hunger of it without feeding it. The city had spoken all day with certainty. The certainty had taught him which doors were shut because they were empty, and which were shut because they contained breath. He would return to those doors when the night had cooled the ink, and the cafes had grown tired of the same story told 3 ways. Then a new sentence would be ready to be said, in a low voice to a large man who did not hurry. On the way back down the hill, passing the church steps where the iron rail held the memory of a struggle, Maigret stopped beneath a failing lamp and relit his pipe. The flame flared, reflected in the damp metal, then steadied. He drew smoke, exhaled, and watched it climb toward the mantle where moths once circled in summer. The press had made a fog of paper over the city, but the night kept its own fog where it mattered. He would enter it again at dawn, not to read, but to listen. By the end of the week, the case had grown larger than the scrap of cloth, larger than the silence of a landlord, larger even than the whispers in Montmartre. It had entered another domain altogether, where words were chosen like weapons, and silences carried more weight than proof. Maigret felt the shift one morning when a discreet note arrived at his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, carried not by a messenger boy in a cap, but by a man in a dark suit who left without waiting for acknowledgement. The envelope bore no name, only a seal pressed faintly into its flap. Inside, a few sentences written in a fine hand requested Maigret's presence at the ministry, phrased not as an order but as something heavier, expectation. He sat with the note in his thick fingers, pipe forgotten, staring at the Seine outside his window. The river rolled on with its indifferent current, carrying barges laden with coal, timber, and grain. The Republic required order, the letter implied, and order required discretion. A policeman missing might be a tragedy in one arrondissement, but in the pages of the press it threatened to become something more, a question of authority itself. At the ministry, the corridors smelled of polish and old paper, the kind of paper that had never known damp basements or the ink-stained hands of printers. The deputy who received Maigret was courteous, soft-spoken, his suit cut with precision. He did not speak of Fournier as a man, but as a problem, one that risked being magnified. "You understand, Inspector?" he said, lowering his voice though the office was empty. "That stability is fragile. The people rely on symbols. If even a policeman can vanish without explanation, what becomes of trust?" Maigret listened, pipe resting unlit in his hand, his eyes on the polished desk between them. He had no patience for symbols. He believed in men, in their weakness, their stubbornness, their lies told out of fear or pride. Fournier had been a man, not a symbol, but he did not say this aloud. He only inclined his head and let the deputy continue. "There are whispers," the man went on, fingers tapping lightly on the blotter, "whispers of negligence, of corruption. You know how the press feeds. We must avoid scandal at any cost. The public cannot be allowed to think that one of their guardians has been swallowed by the fog without consequence. If you must investigate, do so with caution, and above all, discretion." Maigret's pipe remained unlit. He knew the word discretion well. It meant find the truth if you must, but hide its edges so that the city sleeps soundly. It meant let the fog cover as much as it reveals. He left the ministry with the taste of smoke in his mouth, though no match had been struck, the deputy's words clinging like dust to his coat. Back at the quay, Lucas and Janvier waited with fresh reports. None were decisive. A barge captain claimed he had seen Fournier near the canal, but his memory shifted depending on the hour. A washerwoman insisted the uniform scrap could have been from any officer. A letter arrived anonymously, declaring that Fournier had been entangled with radicals who met in wine cellars. Maigret read them all without comment. He knew when a case began to attract the kind of inventions that were less about truth than about what people feared their neighbours might be. In the cafés of Montmartre, the talk had changed tone. No longer only gossip about a man in fog, it had grown into something darker. Men hunched over their glasses muttered of police who looked the other way, of favours exchanged in back rooms, of laws bent by those sworn to enforce them. The disappearance of one uniform had become a mirror in which each man saw his own distrust. Some swore Fournier had been silenced because he knew too much. Others, that he had himself betrayed the oath. Every rumour carried a political colour, and every colour bled into the next until the truth was drowned in a wash of suspicion. Maigret did not argue with the talk. He sat quietly in corners, his pipe smoke rising among the yellow haze of lamps, listening as men contradicted themselves within the same breath. He knew that rumour was like wine poured too quickly. It foamed, it spilled, it left stains. Yet in the froth sometimes floated a kernel of something heavier, something that sank only when the glass was still. One evening he returned to the lodging-house. The landlord opened the door reluctantly, eyes darting toward the shadows behind the inspector. Maigret asked no questions at first. He simply stood in the dim hallway, pipe-lit this time, filling the air with its heavy fragrance. Finally, he said, "They're saying Fournier knew something, that he was silenced. What do you think?" The landlord's lips pressed tight. He wiped his hands on his apron, though they were not dirty. People say many things, safer not to listen. "Safer for you, perhaps," Maigret said quietly. "But Fournier is not safe." The words hung between them, and the landlord flinched as if struck. But he said nothing more. His silence was now edged not with indifference, but with fear. Maigret left him with it, knowing fear sometimes ripened faster than guilt. By the canal, too, politics had begun to seep. Men loitered who had no business with water or barges, their eyes sharp, their voices carrying the clipped accents of offices rather than docks. Lucas noticed them first, nudging Maigret as they walked the towpath. "They're watching us, Chief." "Then let them watch," Maigret murmured. "Perhaps they'll learn what fog looks like up close." He did not underestimate them. Politics was a fog thicker than Montmartre's, and once inside it, men lost their bearings as quickly as Fournier had on that night patrol. Yet Maigret trusted his own pace, the heavy, deliberate tread that had carried him through 100 investigations. He did not rush toward conclusions, nor did he fear the shadows of deputies or editors. He followed silence where it led, pipe smoke curling like a thread through the labyrinth. At the quay he sat long into the night, the scrap of cloth still on his desk. He imagined the whispers weaving around it, corruption, betrayal, scandal. He saw the deputies' thin fingers tapping the blotter, heard the press boys shouting on the boulevards. But beneath the noise lay the simple weight of cloth, torn by a hand. That was where the truth still lived, stubborn and silent. He thought of Fournier's wife, waiting in her modest flat, children asleep in their narrow beds. No deputy had spoken to her of symbols, no newspaper had asked her for a quote. For her, there was only the absence of a man who had left in uniform and not returned. Maigret drew deeply on his pipe and exhaled into the dim room. Politics had entered the case, yes, but he would not let it replace the man with its shadows. The Seine outside moved steadily under the lamps carrying barges east and west. The city whispered in cafes and offices, but the river remained silent, indifferent. Maigret listened to that silence and trusted it more than all the words of men. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, letting the smoke blur the room. Tomorrow, the whispers would grow louder, perhaps more insistent, perhaps more dangerous. But tonight he held only the cloth, the memory of fog, and the certainty that somewhere, hidden in silence, the truth still waited. It was Lucas who first mentioned the abandoned building, though he did so in the hesitant tone of a man offering a possibility rather than a lead. A block of crumbling stone near the edge of Montmartre, once a workshop, then a lodging house, then nothing at all. For years it had stood shuttered, its roof sagging, its windows boarded. Children dared each other to slip inside and came out with dust in their hair and stories of ghosts. To most, it was simply part of the city's backdrop, too ordinary in its decay to attract real attention. Yet Maigret's heavy face stirred when Lucas spoke of it. The landlord's silence, the boy's scrap of cloth, the woman's whisper in the café, all seemed to lean, however faintly, toward places like that. Rooms no longer lived in, but not entirely empty. They went there on a damp afternoon when the sky hung low and the street smelled of wet plaster. The building rose at the end of a narrow passage, its doorway bricked halfway, but left ajar by vandals. Maigret paused at the threshold, pipe smoke curling into the cold air inside. Dust coated the floor in a thick layer, unbroken except where rats had skittered and water had dripped from the roof. The silence was profound, the kind that presses against the eardrums, making even breathing feel intrusive. Lucas stepped ahead, his boots crunching on plaster fragments. Their lantern cast a yellow glow that trembled across the walls. Each room seemed the same, bare boards, cracked plaster, the faint odour of mildew. But when they reached the back of the second floor, Maigret stopped abruptly. The air there was different, still stale but tinged with something more. Tobacco smoke, faint but undeniable, clinging stubbornly as if it had soaked into the very grain of the wood. "Someone's been here," Maigret murmured. The room itself was empty, almost too empty. Dust lay across the floor, undisturbed save for a faint track leading to the far corner. There, half hidden beneath a heap of old rags, rested an object that made Lucas draw in his breath. A policeman's cap. It lay not as if dropped, but placed, the insignia facing outward, the peak aligned with precision. Maigret bent, his knees cracking under his weight, and lifted it with care. Dust clung to the cloth, but beneath the grime it was intact, its badge still gleaming faintly. It was Fournier's. For a long moment neither man spoke. The silence of the room thickened, pressing in on them. Maigret turned the cap slowly in his hands, his eyes heavy. This was no random discard, no accident. It had been put there deliberately, almost ceremonially, as though someone wished it to remain, but not to be found too soon. Lucas shifted uneasily. "Why here, Chief? Why not burn it? Throw it in the canal?" Maigret drew on his pipe, the ember glowing red in the dim light. Because someone wanted it kept, hidden but safe, perhaps as proof, perhaps as warning. He set the cap gently on the table, a table whose surface bore no dust at all, though the rest of the room was thick with it. Someone had sat there recently, their hands resting, perhaps even writing. The inspector's eyes travelled across the walls. In one corner, faint marks where a chair had scraped. In another, a bottle turned on its side, the liquid long evaporated, but the smell of cheap wine still clinging to the cork. It was not a ghost room after all. It was a waiting room, a place where someone returned, someone who had reason to keep silence but needed a refuge for it. He lowered himself heavily into the chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and imagined the scene. Fournier brought here, perhaps willingly at first, led by a voice he trusted. The fog outside, the uniform cap removed, placed with care. A conversation whispered, too low for neighbours to hear. Then what? Violence? Or persuasion? He could not yet tell. But the room seemed to hum with the memory of it. Lucas opened the window, its shutters sticking, and the weak light of afternoon fell across the floor. Dust danced in the beam, but in one patch near the wall the dust was absent, scuffed away. Maigret rose, bent over, and touched the boards. Faint impressions of boots lingered, not one pair, but several. He counted at least 3 sets, maybe more. The room had held more than 2 men. When they left the building, the grey sky had darkened, the first drops of rain tapping on their hats. Maigret carried the cap under his arm, wrapped in his coat. He did not speak until they reached the street. "This is no ordinary disappearance," he said. "Someone wanted him removed from the street, but not from memory. They wanted a mark left, a trace to be discovered when the time was right." Back at the quay, the cap lay on his desk beside the scrap of cloth. The 2 pieces of Fournier's uniform seemed to converse silently, telling fragments of a story neither could finish. Janvier entered and stood looking at them with a frown. "It's as if they're taunting us, Chief." "Not taunting," Maigret replied, his voice low. "Reminding. Whoever did this wanted us to know he was taken, but not why. That's the cruelty of it." The newspapers, when they caught wind of the cap, erupted with fresh invention. Some claimed Fournier had been held hostage in secret by radicals, others that he had joined them willingly and left his uniform behind as rejection of duty. The ministry sent another discreet inquiry, urging caution, urging silence, but Maigret knew better than to bury what the city itself was already beginning to murmur. Night fell heavy over the Seine, the lamps reflected in the dark current. In his office, Maigret sat smoking, the cap and cloth before him, the silence of the hidden room echoing still in his ears. He thought of the dust undisturbed except where boots had pressed, of the chair scraped across the floor, of the careful placement of the cap. It was not the work of a hurried hand. It was deliberate, which meant intention, which meant thought, which meant more than chance. Fournier's absence had begun as a fog, shapeless, a blank in the night. Now it had acquired form, the outline of men moving in silence, of rooms chosen for secrecy, of objects left behind as silent witnesses. The inspector leaned back, pipe between his teeth, and let the smoke blur his vision until the cap seemed to float in haze. Whoever had placed it wanted to control the story. But stories, once begun, have a way of escaping their tellers. He rose, heavy and deliberate, and crossed to the window. The river below moved with its steady indifference, but the city beyond was restless, whispering in cafes, in offices, in attics. The hidden room was no longer hidden. Its silence had been broken, and with it the first crack had appeared in the wall of secrecy that surrounded Fournier's fate. Maigret knew the wall would not hold much longer. And somewhere in Montmartre, in the fog yet to come, the truth waited with the patience of men who believed their silence unassailable. The fog had returned to Paris in the early hours, thick and cloying, as though the city itself wished to forget what had passed. It rose from the Seine, winding its way through the alleys, creeping under doorways, climbing the steep steps of Montmartre like a living thing. It was the kind of fog that smothered, that made men doubt their own reflections in windows, that turned familiar streets into the disorienting labyrinth of a dream. In the cold light of morning, when the first street lamps flickered weakly against the greyness, the city seemed to hold its breath. Maigret stood at the Quai des Orfèvres, his eyes fixed on the dim horizon beyond, where the fog met the river. The city, despite the countless whispers of scandal, despite the hollow stories told in cafes, had returned to its usual rhythm. Trams rolled along their tracks, the bells of Sacré-Cœur chimed across the rooftops, and the sound of boots against cobblestone echoed in the narrow streets. But underneath it all, there was a shift, a tremor in the air, something that had been held back, now ready to break free. Lucas was waiting by the door, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his face drawn with the weariness that comes after days of sifting through half-formed truths. Janvier joined them shortly after, holding a bundle of new reports that, as usual, offered little more than confusion and conjecture. They had followed every lead, interrogated every possible witness, but still the answers seemed to slip through their fingers like water. But Maigret knew that the answers were there, hidden in plain sight. They had always been there, tucked between the lines of testimony, buried under the weight of fear and suspicion. He had felt it from the moment the case had landed on his desk, the weight of something larger, something that had nothing to do with the missing policeman, but with the city itself, its dark undercurrent of political tension and unspoken alliances. "There's something we're missing," Maigret said, his voice low but steady, as though he were speaking to himself as much as to his colleagues. "It's not about Fournier. It never was." Lucas and Janvier exchanged glances, their brows furrowing in confusion. Maigret turned slowly, his hands clasped behind his back as he walked toward the window. "Everyone is looking at Fournier," he continued, his voice taking on a quiet urgency. "The uniform, the cap, the canal, the woman in the café, the rumors, they're all looking in the wrong direction." "Then where do we look?" Janvier asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "We've followed every lead." Maigret paused, gazing out over the fog-covered city, his gaze unfocused. For a moment, he was lost in the rhythm of the city, the pulse of it that he had come to know better than his own heartbeat. Paris, with all its secrets, all its layers of history, was a place that never revealed itself easily. But beneath the fog, Maigret knew the truth was waiting, and in the quiet stillness of the morning, he could almost hear it. "We look beyond the fog," Maigret said at last, his voice soft but resolute. "We look at who benefits from Fournier's disappearance. We look at what's been hiding in plain sight." There was silence in the room as Lucas and Janvier processed his words. The weight of the case, of the questions that had piled up and circled around without answer, seemed to hang in the air. Maigret turned back toward his desk, where the torn cloth and the policeman's cap still lay, each piece of the puzzle a clue that had been carefully placed but not fully understood. His eyes lingered on the cap for a moment, and then he reached for it. It had been placed in that abandoned room deliberately, as if someone wanted to ensure it was found, yet hidden it remained. "It's all here," Maigret said, his voice thoughtful, as if speaking to himself again. "A torn uniform, a cap left behind, a man's life erased. But why? What's the message?" Janvier and Lucas moved closer, leaning over the desk, each man drawn into the puzzle Maigret had begun to unravel. But there was still a final piece missing, an answer that would illuminate the darkness and pull back the fog for good. The answer came when they least expected it, not from a witness, not from a confession, but from a forgotten document, a letter hidden in a drawer of Fournier's desk at the commissariat, overlooked by everyone but Maigret. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, a scribbled note that had been tucked away hastily, as though its writer had known it would be dangerous to keep. It was unsigned, but its words were unmistakable. "The balance is fragile. A single misstep, and everything falls. We are watching. Keep quiet. If anyone asks about Fournier, send them to the ministry. His disappearance is not just about him." The message was simple, but it carried with it the weight of something far larger than a missing policeman. Maigret had suspected as much all along. Fournier had been caught in something bigger than himself. His disappearance was not about a personal vendetta or an act of violence, but about the stability of a fragile system. "This isn't just a matter of a policeman going missing," Maigret said quietly, as he passed the letter to Lucas. This is about control, about power, and about what happens when those in power begin to fear losing it. Lucas and Janvier read the letter, their faces growing more and more grim as they absorbed its implications. The ministry, the whispers in the cafes, the stories that had been carefully crafted, everything pointed toward a larger conspiracy, a political maneuver that had seen a single man removed not just for what he knew, but for what he might have said. "We need to go back to the ministry," Maigret said, standing up suddenly, his pipe resting between his teeth. "We're no longer looking for a missing policeman. We're looking for a man who knew too much and was silenced for it, and the people who silenced him are still out there." He paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he considered the final steps of the investigation. The fog, still hanging thick over the streets of Paris, had begun to lift, but not completely. There were still shadows to chase, still secrets to uncover. As Maigret, Lucas and Janvier made their way through the streets toward the ministry, the fog began to thin, the light of the day cutting through the mist. The city, ever shifting, ever restless, seemed to breathe a little more freely, as if the pressure of the mystery was lifting, revealing the truth behind it. The ministry was quiet when they arrived, the building as imposing as ever. Maigret walked through the corridors with the same steady pace he had always had, his mind focused, his purpose clear. He was no longer chasing rumors or following false leads. Now he was chasing the truth, and the truth had no interest in remaining hidden any longer. Inside the minister's office, Maigret did not ask questions. He didn't need to. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of the letter still hanging over them all. When the minister finally spoke, his voice was strained, as though the words had been rehearsed over and over again. "You're asking questions we cannot answer, Maigret," the minister said, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "Fournier was caught in something larger than we could control. His silence was necessary. There was no other choice." Maigret's eyes locked with the minister's, and in that moment the fog lifted entirely. Everything made sense. The conspiracy, the politics, the manipulation, it was all there in plain sight, hidden only by the fog of fear. "We'll see," Maigret said softly, his voice calm, almost detached. "But the truth always comes out, sooner or later. And when it does, no fog will be thick enough to hide it."